Well, in my previous video, I was a bit surprised in the reaction in that I was surprised at how positive or not bad the reaction was. As of posting this video, the ratings are like 50 something to 20 something, 52 to 22 like dislike. So very heavily in the positive on that last video. Maybe that's because of the channel I posted it on. Hard to say, but maybe if I posted it on Fringe Elements, it would be closer. If I posted it on Fringe Elements, I wouldn't expect it to do much worse than even. Anyway, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding of what I said. Not a misunderstanding. Making up writers to what I said. A lot of I'll just leave it at that. First off, my position on regulations. Lots of my positions are actually the same. My view of regulations is still mostly negative. I mostly don't like regulations on business practices, regulating hiring and firing people, zoning laws, licensing laws. So on that, I'm largely about the same as I was before. In terms of if I was in charge of a country and this country was put on the world stage, it would rank close to the top in terms of economic freedom. Ease of doing business would be higher and be up there with Hong Kong and Singapore still, right? So I say, fascism is kind of a shock thing, but also a philosophical thing, which I'll get into. But really, I'm not like... I would still be, compared to the Republican and Democrat Party, I would still be considered, heavily libertarian. In fact, my views, compared to mainstream politics, would be closer to radical libertarianism still than Rand Paul, for example. Now, I also recognize the importance of economic freedom. There are several episodes of this. We can compare Ireland to the United Kingdom, for example, as an episode of, the benefits of economic freedom. We can also look at East Germany versus West Germany. North Korea and South Korea is a bit of an extreme example. Of course, the level of economic freedom that I support is much greater than it currently exists in Ireland. Maybe a little bit less than what exists in Singapore, depending on how you define economic freedom. I think it would depend. I think it would be kind of a hash. Hong Kong, Singapore, and what I advocate would kind of throw them in a bag, and it would depend on how you rate, what you count as economic freedom. They're so close that the weightings matter. When looking at the world and the Heritage Foundations and the Fraser Institutes, their indexes of economic freedom, usually the magnitudes are so great, and usually when you rank countries, a country has higher effective taxes, high and more difficulty doing businesses, and a crappier. And it's a general trend usually, right? You get into disputes when you have a country where it says, well, their legal system is better, but it's harder to start a business, so which is more free? Well, that's where you get into value judgments, is in those areas. But the big picture, these which has more economic freedom, Zambia or Denmark. Well, Denmark by a million miles is more free than Zambia, whatever. So, and economic freedom does matter, because economic freedom is going to tell you how you're going to be able to apply the technology that currently exists. If you don't have any economic freedom, then you're going to go back into the Stone Age. And it doesn't matter that, right, if we take a look at North Korea, it doesn't matter that North Korea largely has access to modern Western technology. If they don't apply it, they don't get it, right? But when looking at the big picture, in terms of economic development, the big picture, standards of living improve from new technology, okay? And new technology that comes from basic research. So you can have extreme cases like North Korea, but if you take a less extreme case, where you had a much more reasonable central planners and you had more tolerance for pseudo-markets in the Soviet Union, you had a much better standard of living. You had improvements in standard of living in the Soviet Union from the Tsarist days when Russia had more economic freedom. Russia in 1980 was a much better place in terms of standard of living, life expectancy, and in health, and surgical operations, medical technology, agricultural technology. Soviet Union was a much better place to live in 1980 than it was in 1912, right? And that incredible improvement in standard of living in the Soviet Union, or the area of the Soviet Union, didn't come from more economic freedom or the application of existing technology. It came from new technology. We can do the same thing. Let's compare Hungary in the year 1930 to Hungary in the year 1980. Well, Hungary was much better off in the year 1980 than it was in the year 1930. Why? Well, I mean, it was economically much freer in the year 1930 than in 1980, so why would it be better off in 1980? Well, because of technology, better technology. So you can see the standard of living development in a country being like the filling out of a frame. And the bigger the frame, the easier it is to fill out. For example, getting from 0% utilization of technology to 50% utilization is much easier than going from 50% to 70%, right? As you get more and more filled out in terms of your economic potential, it gets harder and harder to make further progress. And that's why we see the catch-up effect in poor countries. Poor countries, due to their very low economic freedom, poorer countries have much more, it's easier for them to experience economic growth because they're further down. The developments that are needed to make the economies in these poor countries much more productive are much more basic. They're much easier, like putting in a well, putting in an irrigation system. They're very simple things that we know how to do very easily in these poor countries. And because of that, what ends up happening is poor country, because they're less economically free, they fall behind the freer country. They also fall behind white countries just by dint of the biological differences. But the bigger reason they fall behind is because of lack of economic freedom. Now, we could then argue that the lack of economic freedom is a product of the biology. That's a bit more debatable. I'm not so sure about that. I'd want to look into that more. But the main reason they fall behind, the main direct reason, is because of their lack of economic freedom. Now, is the lack of economic freedom caused by the biology? And so we could say the lack of economic freedom is itself a result of biology. That's another question, but we know that it's mainly economic freedom, right? We look at wealth disparities within Africa, compare Botswana to, say, the Congo, and we can see, Botswana having Botswana having a per capita income higher than that of the Ukraine. We could say, okay, that shows the prime importance of economic freedom in terms of economic development. Where was I going with this? But anyway, but as a country fills out more and more and more, further economic gains become more and more difficult. You have to have ever escalating levels of economic freedom in order to fill out to your production possibilities frontier, to fill out, to get closer and closer to 100%. And that's all economic freedom can do. Economic freedom can do is push you to that outer limit in your basically your forget what that's called, the production possibilities frontier curve. That's all greater economic freedom can do. It can just push that out. It can't push the curve itself out further. All it can do is push you further and further to that maximal efficiency. It can't push out your actual production any further. Right? But of course, if your capital utilization is so poor, 1% of modern technology is going to be about on the level of, say, 70% utilization of the technology of the Middle Ages. So you can have modern technology, like North Korea, like you can have modern technology, but if you're utilizing the technology at like whatever North Korea is utilizing, say, in my mind's eye, it's like 5%. Well, that would be like, 90% utilization of the technology in the Middle Ages. And of course, I also would argue that that central planning is easier to do when you have a more primitive, when you have less technology. Central planning is easier to do because there's less to centrally plan. There's less variables. There's less, farming is what it is. It's down to a pretty simple science. And if you've been doing it for 1,000 years, a central planner can plan it and basically do anyway. We can also look at, say, the United States in the year 1960 versus the United States today. The United States today is materially better off, worse off in several other ways. But we could say in terms of, the production of stuff and access to stuff, material things, the United States has more stuff per capita than it did in the year 1960. Why is that? Is it because the United States is more efficiently utilizing technology that it has? Or is it because technology has gotten better, or some mixture of both? Well, I think, in my view, to even ask that question is a bit silly. Right? The reason that we have more physical stuff in the United States today is not because of some superiority of the system. In fact, the system has gotten inferior. Economic freedom has declined. It's more and more difficult for any individual to actualize their lives. I recall an example of, the stories about men who started off as busboys and ended up running the whole company. That's great. That's a sign of great efficiency of a company, that you have have the best and the brightest running it. Now you have, I don't want to get into this, but in addition to the increase in the web of difficulty in starting a business, companies themselves have gotten more and more professional, and that's not a good thing. And by professional, I don't mean well, and maybe in some instances it's more controlled in their processes and what they do, so maybe there's fewer errors. I'm skeptical about that. But what I've noticed is that an increase in professional mentality. It's professionalism. I've begun to realize is a code for conformity, and I wonder if college has something to do with it, because you're getting people who the only people who are getting hired are people who go to college, and so you end up getting not stupid people, but conformist people, not necessarily the best thinkers. Right? You get and so I think college has something to do with that, and then of course the college cult is also it delays entry into the workforce, and it costs a bunch of money. It sucks resources into basically unproductive activity, right? And I didn't really script this out very well. I'm just kind of going off in all different directions. So anyway, so that's really my view. And so my views on economic freedom are kind of what they've been for a long time. It's just I haven't really formalized this. I haven't really formalized, because you can't really say, because when you're talking about the benefits of economic freedom, like you can't say that all of the improvements in standard of living from the year 1700 to today are a result of increase in economic freedom. You can't say that, because the world was economically more in the U.S., or what was to become the U.S. was much more economically free in the year 1700 than it is today, right? And the U.S. has gotten progressively less free, basically in a kind of a linear fashion for as long as it has been recorded. The U.S. has gotten less and less free. So how can we attribute this great productivity increase to economic freedom? Well, what you can do is you can say, well, the U.S. is more free than its neighbors, and that's why it's wealthier than its neighbors. But that's maybe. That may be sort of true. But the U.S. is a big country. It's been free from wars. It has had lots of immigrants come in, and now has a huge population. Okay, there are all sorts of other factors that can explain the rise of the United States, other than high levels of economic freedom. And to what degree the United States was more economically free than the United Kingdom? Not much more. We can say that we can compare the United States to. The United States was certainly no more economically free than Canada, and yet the United States has about 10 times the population and about 10 times the GDP of Canada, and it's been about that way for as long as it's been recorded. Right? The United States has basically been 10 Canadas for as long as data has been collected on it. Australia. Was Australia less economically free than the United States? Yeah. So economic freedom can explain things. Differences in economic freedom, for example, it can explain why West Germany was wealthier than East Germany. Okay, it can explain why North Korea is way poorer than South Korea. North Korea is obviously a much more extreme example, a much more extreme totalitarian state than the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc were. And it can explain, right? But of course, economic freedom can't explain why Norway is much wealthier than the United Kingdom, despite scoring consistently lower on indexes of economic freedom. What explains why Norway is wealthier than the United Kingdom is access to oil reserves. Right? There's basically free money coming in. That explains why Norway is wealthier. So, New Europe, this theoretical state. What should the goals of a country be? Well, the big improvements in standard of living are not going to come from the more efficient utilization of capital, right? The more efficient utilization of capital can get you to, say, being Ireland as opposed to being the United Kingdom. It can give you the standard of living that exists in Ireland versus the relatively poor standard of living that exists in the United Kingdom. Okay, that's not world-beating. It's not going to be a world-beating difference. And I think when libertarians get their total market economy, they're going to be a bit disappointed in how it's not a brave new world in terms of improvements in standard of living. How when they get their total market, what it's going to be is it's going to be like, for example, let's say per capita income in the United States is about $50,000 per capita. capita, they get their total market that'll go up to maybe 70,000 per capita. Big improvement, okay, but it's not, but it's still the same basic economy. It's still the same basic technology. It's just that more people have jobs. Maybe the companies are a little bit smarter. I'm doubtful about that. The college cult, for example, what sustains the college cult is not federal funds, okay? I don't have access to it right now, but the great increase in spending on college has overwhelmingly come from private sources. And if you want to, why is college becoming such a big thing? Well, the reason college is becoming such a big thing is because employers demand it, right? They won't even let you in to have an interview if you don't have a college degree, okay? And that's not the government telling employers to do that, okay? That's employers choosing to do that. That's their choice. That's employers doing that. This is a rotten culture that is emerging on the market. It's not something that the government did. I mean, you can say, oh, look, the government is spending more and more on college, and let's have another libertarian just so story to explain any market failure on some government intervention, no matter how transient or indirect. We say, well, the government intervention, it was like this thing and it had unintended butterfly effects, and that's why we have this insane college cult. No, the reason we have insane college cults is because employers are stupid. There's the meme of college spread through employers. Everyone thinks you need it, and employers are just systematically uncreative, and they're not, they're uncreative in their hiring practices and their evaluation practices, and so they persist in doing stupid things, right? And we see it over and over. We look at a company and we say for example, a company using a data entry method from Y2K, like Arini was talking about, and are we going to blame that on lack of competition in the market, that more efficient producers are gonna... You don't know that. I mean, you think that might happen, but we don't know that. Like, and it's kind of still... And for example, Aaron Clarey talking about how they continued to fax things in the age of email and, ridiculously inefficient ways of doing banking. They continued to fax. So what? So if they had more competition, that department of that company would say, oh, we need to do email in order to save money. And like to what extent did their stopping of using fax machines, did that even directly affect the bottom line in a way that department could even feel, right? Because that's what the idea of competition is based on. It's based on companies feeling the pain of their inefficiencies and causing them to adapt to it. But to what extent do they even feel that pain, right? I don't see them even feeling it. So if the market was more competitive, and moreover, like the companies using the track inventory management system or whatever dumb software they were using at Arini's job, or the stupid using of fax machines at the banking job that Aaron Clarey had, to what extent would those go away if there was a competitive market? I don't see why they would. I really don't. Okay, I could see them going away if the company itself goes under. But does the company that replaced them not have those practices? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If you're a libertarian kind of who sees market activity almost robotically as like these lines of the kind of razor's edge of efficiencies and hard competition that grinds out perfection, that's a bit of a straw man. They don't believe in total perfection. But to an extent, that's what they believe. To an extent that they believe in this kind of matrix of equilibria that cuts off, that shaves off inefficiencies, and these things go away. And so whenever you have a systematic failure, such as the college cult, and I think it's becoming more and more apparent that the college cult is a systematic failure, libertarians, they can't, that's an obvious market failure to me. Because, what's causing the college cult? Employers are. Go ask them. And you could say, oh, well, the reason employers are able to get away with these inefficient hiring practices is because there's a lack of competition in the marketplace. Really? I mean, first off, that's a just so story. But second off, you can go up to employers and you can tell them why it's stupid. You can show them data that shows quite clearly that a college education does not improve an individual's productive ability unless it's a really specialized thing. Unless it's like 5% of the STEM, even most STEMs, they don't, for example, computer programming, most of what you learn is not what you're going to actually use on the job. So even most STEM degrees are not particularly useful to employers. It's really a tiny fraction of the STEMs who learn something that's actually applicable to their job. And that's something that's really obvious. And that's something you can tell employers. And you can put data in front fun of them, and it's not a really a debatable thing, but employers still do it. And you say, well, more competition will cause them to not do it. Why? Will they go out of business? Maybe, maybe not. You know, maybe they'll stay in business with their inefficient practices because they're bigger and they have economies of scale and they're incumbents. It happens. General Motors still exists, you know. Oh, but they got the bailout. Well, they existed for as long as they did up to the point where they got the bailout, you know, and maybe they would have gone, you know, anyway. But what I'm saying is that the efficiency of markets are overstated. And yes, economic freedom, all else being equal, is good. And generally, and I'm pretty hard on regulations. I'm still basically a hard libertarian on matters of labor regulation. Environmental regulations you can make more of a case for, because environmental regulations don't deal with economic issues, they deal with the environment. You're basically saying, you need to regulate this because we value the environment. And so that's something you can make a case for because you're not having to argue economic efficiency of them. You just have to say, well, I like green stuff. And well, I mean, you know, that becomes kind of a subjective value judgment. What do you care more about? Nike Freeze or nice trees? You know? But yeah, but in terms of long-term economic growth, basic research is where it's at. And there's a global commons problem with basic research in that any country that does basic research, well, that the benefits of that goes to the whole globe, right? It goes to, you know, brown people around the world, goes to white people around the world, yellow people around the world. Everyone benefits from basic research. Basic research done in Holland, you know, maybe at first it's going to benefit Holland the most, but in, you know, 5 years, certainly within 10 years, it's going to benefit the world over, you know. So, but that's where the production possibilities frontier curve pushes out. It's from basic research. It's not from development, right, which is product development, right? And in the United States, I forget, I think it was in 2010 or 2006, about $340 billion was spent on R&D. And you may look at that and go, wow, that's a lot. That's a lot that was spent on R&D. Well, most of it went into product development, not even research. Let me look for it. I put the numbers on a post on Facebook here. Okay, 2010. Basic research, $69.2 billion was spent on basic research. $71.7 billion was spent on applied research. $250 billion was spent on product development, right? I think I'll post this in the description. But, you know, Terence Keeley appears to have been wrong. The best way to get basic research is to have government funding. Dollar per dollar, industry is interested in product development first and foremost by a wide margin, by a huge margin. Okay, then applied research, and lastly, basic research. They're interested in what makes money next quarter or next year. And if basic research was the most profitable form of research, as Terence Keeley claimed, well, why aren't companies doing it more, you know? In the olden days, I would say companies aren't investing in basic research because basic research just isn't profitable to them. But now, I'm not so sure. You know, maybe they're not doing basic research because the people making the PowerPoint presentations to the bean counters aren't able to make a persuasive case. You know, that it has nothing to do with reality, but it has everything to do with what can be made, what presenters in boardroom meetings can make a case for, right? And this is something that a lot of people haven't, a lot of libertarians haven't worked in big businesses, I think have a hard time seeing, is that what businesses do is not dependent upon what's actually the best mode of action, but on what they are convinced is the best mode of action. Okay, if you look at a business as like a large person or a collection of person, well, that's how people behave. People don't behave necessarily in the ways that best that makes them the happiest, that increases, that maximizes their utility. They behave in ways that they want to behave in at the moment, and on the other hand, what they think will maximize their utility, but not necessarily what maximizes their utility. You know, I mean, we've done it from time to time. We've you know, done things, and we went, why the hell did I do that? That wasn't enjoyable or beneficial in any way. Why the hell did I do that? Right? Because why do people do that? Well, psychology is complicated, and it's not, you know, and this is kind of a straw man to an extent, like. To an extent, this is a straw man of libertarians, because libertarians don't believe in homo economicus, okay? But they believe in something closer to that than what can be observed in reality, right? Libertarians are further off the mark from how humans actually behave. They don't believe in homo economicus, but they believe in something closer to homo economicus than what actually is. Okay, so, and that's, and the college cult, for example, that's an obvious thing. That's an obvious problem that can be corrected with state funding, all right? What a government can do is the government can have a nationalized school system. Okay, this is scary to a lot of people because nationalized school systems can be used for a lot of horrible ideologies, okay? And so we can get into a discussion about, well, this is what you think in your ideal state plan if you had all the levers of power, but realistically, what do you think this will actually be used for? Okay, granted, that's a useful next level of discussion, but I mean, I've already gone into great depth the stupidity of the college system and the university system. First off, the 2 years of undergrad crap is not useful. For 95% of people, it's not useful, period. So what you do is you have a national school system where what you do is you train people, you get them certified in trades, and then, at the very least, they've spent less time doing bullshit. So if their certification ends up not being of any use, at the very least, they haven't wasted as much time as they would have in college. Okay? So, and they have some sort of skill, right? And, if they know how to plumb, well, okay, then they know how to plumb. If they know how to be an electrician, well, okay, they know how to wire things. All right, cool. At least they got something. You get a degree in... okay, let's say this. Let's say you get a degree in physics, right? And that's one of the STEM degrees. Okay, you got a degree in physics. Well, what can you do with that? What will an employer hire you to do with that? I don't know. It's not even STEM degrees may not be as practical as you think. So, and I mean, what you can do with a centrally managed education system is you can experiment. You can say, hey, why don't we look at what education methods actually work and implement those? Right? Let's see. Well, do we need to put people in classrooms, or can we have proctored learning? Can we have kind of a proctored system where we send kids to school and basically they sit in front of a computer? As bad as that sounds, but they can sit in front of a computer, learn things faster, get through things faster, move at their own pace, and then they can spend more time, they can get through their school quicker, and they can actually do more socializing because they're not having to spend so much time in an inefficient classroom environment, right? And we could say, oh, it's computerized learning is horrible because it's impersonal, but, if it gets it done faster, you can end up having more time for little kids, more recess time, more free time, you can have more of that because the actual education time is much more efficient. So on the whole, it could actually be better. It could be a better system both for socializing and obviously for the actual learning thing, right? But of course, that's not something that's even being experimented. On the one hand, and now one argument that I often got for that I would put forward as to why proctored learning is not occurring at the level of elementary schools and high schools is because the state runs elementary schools and high schools and they tell you how to run them, right? If it's a private school, they tell you how to run them. But I'm looking at colleges, and the way colleges are run, and the way employers embrace the college cult. They demand prospective employees to have a college degree. Well, I'm not seeing this evidence that this mode of schooling would go away in the market. Now, certainly it would be more efficient with funds. That's definitely the case. Private schools are definitely far more efficient with their funds. But are they going to move away from the old model and move towards a proctored learning method and get through it a lot quicker and better? Will they do that if they're not hamstrung by government regulations? I'm not so sure. I mean, the closest example we could look at would be homeschool, and but I'm just not seeing any real. I'm not seeing any real attempt at private enterprise trying to do this even pseudo legally under the table. Like what you would expect to see if what was holding back schooling and education at the lower levels was government standards. If that really was the case, and once the government standards were removed, schools would rush headlong into more efficient education methods. What you would expect to see is the state having a hard time with groups of parents homeschooling their kids in proctored learning sessions that cause them to go through the curriculum, years ahead of schedule, right? But you don't see that as a problem systematically, right? You don't see it. Now, every once in a while, like you'll have homeschool teachers get kids to graduate high school at 14 or whatever, right? And that just speaks to the horrible inefficiency of the current school system. But But is that system, is this mode, this Prussian mode of education, well, would this go away in a free market? Well, what did you have? That's not quite fair. I was going to say, well, what did you have before you had the Prussian mode of education where you had the one-room schoolhouse? But of course, that was a mode of education that existed prior to, modern communications technology, so that's not exactly a fair comparison to say that the market was like that. But it's also not entirely certain that a market would move towards better education. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say here. To sum it up, I also got some really shitty comments. I got someone saying, oh, are you like a Marxist now? Right, I'm saying that the wealthy people in the United States are not necessarily producing value. I mean, one thing you could look at is like CEO pay, and how CEO pay doesn't matter at all in terms of CEO. Like the CEOs who get paid doesn't bear much resemblance in terms of their actual productivity. And there's companies that switched out high paying a CEO they paid a ton to a CEO they paid nothing, and there's virtually no change in performance. A similar thing in terms of and how markets are not all they're cracked out to be would be the pay of football coaches, right? The pay of football coaches, I think, is another example of how you don't necessarily get what you pay for, and the market is not that efficient, right? So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I'm still generally largely in favor of economic freedom to a much greater degree than the average person in the world. The level of economic freedom I think I propose would be akin to Singapore and Hong Kong. Now, in terms of a specific government that I would propose, it's actually quite simple. I don't have much faith in constitutions, so what I would support would be a system where you have an oligarchy. It's 30 people. It's like the Politburo in the Soviet. That's not, people hear that, oh, Soviet Union, that's how far from libertarianism can you get? Well, it's a Politburo of 30 people. And at the outset, we make sure that these people believe the right things. Basically, what I think. And these people, they then make laws from on high, and this is the national law. They make laws. Those laws are enforced by default across the entire country. However, each county, through a referendum, can repeal line item or the whole thing or any part of a law. They can repeal a law if they get 70% support. Right? Supermajority support of any county to oppose a law. That law will be overturned, and I also support, and it's then overturned for a year. Then within a year's time, if some people want to then put that law in place, they can have another referendum, and if they get 70% votes supporting the law, then the national law is then put in place. So it's 70% either way, and that's to limit the tyranny of the of the oligarchy, right? And the reason I support an oligarchy as opposed to a monarchy is because with a monarchy, you can have a mad monarch. You can have an insane monarch. And I support a system where the person who leaves the oligarchy picks their successor. And they pick their successor beforehand should they die. Hopefully they would keep such information a secret, lest someone have a motive of speeding up their death. But you could also have a situation where a person can only name so many successors. And if the existing oligarchs don't approve of the successor, they then choose a successor. Right? So you have a guy, he picks 5 successors, right? However, the successor has to be approved by the oligarchy, right? And the reason for this is because let's say you have a guy who's in the oligarchy, he dies, he names a successor, and the successor was a secret communist, right? He was pretending to believe what the guy believed, but then he came on and said, haha, fooled you all, I am now a communist. And now this communist names 5 successors when he's about to go. Well, he names all communists, the oligarchy can then say, nope, you're out, and we're going to replace you with our guy, right? And so you have that process in place to restore the oligarchy. Should, for whatever reason, a progressive, liberal, communist, Marxist, whatever, Muslim person get into the oligarchy? Should someone like that get in? First off, there's 30 of them, and because there's 30 of them, if one gets in, there's really not a whole lot he can do. I guess theoretically, you could have a series of these secret communists come in, and they each name their successor, but it would have to be a really long-term plot to get enough of them in order to get 16 of them in, at which point they could then reveal that they're all communists and then take over the oligarchy and run things that way. But that would be a really long, difficult thing. It's hard to keep secrets. And so anyway, so first off, there's 30 of them, so if one of them goes nuts, or a successor is nuts, it's not the end of the world like it is with a monarchy. If the king goes nuts, then, you have Caligula Caligula. You have the right. Things go really bad really fast if you have a mad monarch. A mad oligarch can be kind of ignored and overruled by the rest of them. But on top of that, once that oligarch goes, gets long in the tooth and dies, there's then a system to prevent that oligarch from naming his own successor, so that the rest of the oligarch can say, no, you're a communist, we don't want you, you're out, right? So that's why you have that, and you do that so you can have sensible policy. But you also have a system in which the counties can overrule any law that they want in order to prevent tyranny. And this is and I toyed with the idea of having military be a separate thing, that the counties could not overrule military spending. But then I thought, well, that just opens the door to bullshit, because then you classify whatever you want as military. You can then have a innovative oligarchy could then could then come up with another category of laws that cannot be vetoed at the county level, right? And the county veto is very important in terms of limiting any potential tyranny of the oligarchy. So the way military funding would work is that what the oligarchs could do is they could have a law that they pass, but that in order to basically a military budget, but in order for the military budget to go through, a certain proportion of the counties or population of the counties would have to vote for it. For example, you could say, well, we'll have the military budget that is passed, but only if 90% or more of the counties approve of it. That is, 90% of the counties don't have a referendum to disapprove of it, basically. And by default, it is approved. But so what this does is that any individual county would be thinking, well, if I vote in favor of this, I could be left holding the bag, having to pay for it while the other counties are free riding. But, the oligarchy could say, well, we'll only pass it if 90% or more of the counties vote for it. And so that limits the amount of free riding. The oligarchy could try a unanimous resolution, could try to pass a budget and say the military budget must have unanimous support. That may be a bit difficult because all you need is one county to veto it, to shoot it down. But if you had something like 90%, that seems more realistic. You could get one county here or there that ends up not paying the military budget, in which case people could move there, in which case the oligarchy... Well, I don't want to get into that. I basically outlined the basic system, the basic form of government. There's 1,000,001 problems that can occur with any form of government. And I also have an idea regarding immigration and citizenship. That would be dealt with something different. That would be dealt with not with the oligarchy or the counties, but it would be dealt with a third organization that would deal entirely with citizenship and immigration. This organization really wouldn't do much. The reason they wouldn't do much is because there's no changing in the laws. And this is like a mini oligarchy. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be 10, 15, could be 100 oligarchs in there. But these people, from the outset, the first people in there would all be basically European racialists. Right? There'd be keep the country white, keep out people of other races, period. And they would all be ideologues that way. And it's possible that and they then select their successors, and they have the same system where the successors have to be approved by everyone else and all that. And like with the national government, there is a possibility that you could get a takeover. But I think that's better than having the national government, or much better still than having the counties decide citizenship and immigration, right? Because the national government, they're dealing with other issues, right? And so you could get successors that come in. Well, you agree with me on this, but not on race. But we've kind of softened on the race question, so we're going to let you become an oligarch anyway. And so you have a kind of slow... This body of citizenship and immigration, that's all they do, okay? And so there is less of a possibility of softening, because there's not the political give and take of other issues, right? It's just immigration and it's just citizenship. So there's not a whole lot of trade going on. It's just, right, they could meet once a year. They could say, what's our immigration policy? White only. And they'll have some definition of what is white. That could lead to a problem in that they could develop a more and more expansive definition of what exactly constitutes, European ancestry. But, that's another problem. We could have a discussion on that, on what sort of hard limits, lines that they cannot cross in terms of genetic similarities or something. Maybe you could come up with some sort of genetic test, which of course in 100 years would become obsolete, and basically you'd have this citizenship criteria criteria which is based on a test which is to become obsolete, but you need to draw a line in the sand somewhere, and you need to do it from the outset. So that's better than having a living immigration interpretation, right? That's definitely what you don't want. You don't want a living document for the immigration law, right? Because you have a living document and suddenly Australian Aborigines are now white, right? You don't want that. And my view is that having a separate body just for that is going to keep that law static much easier than if immigration law resided with the national body, right? So anyway, so that's just what I'm thinking. That's just my views, my change of views regarding the state. Some people are going to go, might feel vindicated, saying that libertarian realist, I predicted he would go this way. For some people, they've known this shift a long while ago. It was actually quite a long way coming. I don't have, I kind of took a little bit of a piss out of libertarians here. I don't have a real disdain towards libertarians in the way Spock kind of did. Spock kind of seemed to really hate them. I have issues with them, but libertarians have a lot of good points. It's mainly when they're criticizing government action. That's when libertarians are at their best. But of course, it's a lot easier to criticize than to actually propose a positive theory. So it's not surprising that libertarians are at their best when they're criticizing the state. But they have a very unrealistic view of humans. They're much closer to Homo economicus than actually exists, and their view of markets is, I think, a bit unrealistic. And they always say this. They have these just so stories. Oh, it's government intervention that's causing it. If we just got the government out of there, the markets would be so much better. And they also miss the point of what economic growth really is. They focus almost exclusively on the utilization of existing technology, which free markets tend to do better at than just about any central planning. Okay, but of course, I don't advocate any real central planning. What I talked about paternalism is I talked about basically subsidizing certain behaviors and taxing other behaviors. Okay, and you can say that's central planning to a degree. I support kind of a tax on high fructose corn syrup, for example, and sugar, right? Because sugar's bad for you. I support a tax write-off for things like exercise and gym membership, and perhaps look into sort of a tax credits for health, right? Because if you have a national, and you can justify that because if you have a national health system, you can say, well, because you're healthy, you're not going to cause, you're engaging in activity that we know systematically will reduce your health costs. Now, it's possible that you're going to, just get cancer because you're genetically predisposed to getting it. Even though you're doing everything you can to be healthy, you end up getting cancer. Okay, that's possible. But generally, systematically, if you subsidize healthy behavior, people are going to need less medical services later down the road. And so that's a smart policy to do, even if it's just from a purely fiscal standpoint. But it's also good in terms of just the well-being of people. Right? People are happier. They're more energized. They're in better moods just because they've engaged in exercise. Such exercise they would not have engaged in had it not been could they not justify it financially? Right? Because you can say, well, people who are interested in money, making money all the time, they could say, well, I'm going to exercise because that's going to help me with my taxes. Right? It becomes a real financial thing. So not only are they benefited in terms of taxes from their point of view, but they also get all the health benefits of doing so. So it's a really and plus once you get more and more people doing that thing, it becomes more social, right? More and more normal people become exercise people, and yeah, it's just a cascading of good effects, right? And that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, and that's the kind of stuff that the guns of the state, shaking guns at people's faces, can obviously do. And people talk about the calculation problem like it's some real complex thing. No, it's not a complex thing. The effects of exercise and the effects of tax credits is not a complex thing. We know very well what that government action is gonna result in, just as we know what price ceilings and price floors are gonna do, right? When Austrians say that, when you implement price controls, you're gonna get what always happens, long lines and shortages. Well, there you go. That's Austrians, knowing to an extent the effects of central planning, right? And that kind of, and so the calculation problem is like, well, okay, yeah, calculation problem, but nobody's really talking about the state deciding how much cotton or tea or concrete to produce. Like, that's not what's being debated here. So you talk about the calculation problem. Okay, but the Soviet Union doesn't really exist anymore. And moreover, the Soviet Union, through its history, used pseudo markets. It wasn't complete central planning as anyway. I'm going off on all sorts of different tangents here. That's just what I wanted to say in this video. I think I've said all I needed to say. I don't really have much of a conclusion. So, that's it.